Shootings at educational institutions in the United States of America are not uncommon, as are attempts at mass shootings in general. According to researchers at Harvard University, since 2011, such incidents in America have occurred about once every 64 days, whereas from 1982 to 2011, they were recorded no more than once every 200 days. Usually, people with mental disorders or personality disorders decide to do this, and then they either take their own lives or are killed by a police bullet. They are not spared. They are monsters to society, officials, law enforcement, and even psychiatrists. But even in such dismal statistics, there are sometimes episodes that literally make your blood run cold. On February 12, 2010, at exactly 4:15 p.m. local time, the first shot rang out on one of the campuses of the University of Alabama in the city of Huntsville. Then another and another. It happened in a conference room where a meeting of biology professors was taking place. Law enforcement quickly arrived on the scene, fully prepared to arrest a vengeful student or a cruel fool who decided to settle scores with the teachers. However, they ended up arresting a petite 44-year-old woman, a brunette with a tight bob and a straight old-fashioned fringe. She herself came out of the building after washing the blood off her pistol, leaving it in the toilet along with her stained jacket, and surrendered to the police without resisting the officers. "I'm done," the criminal told her husband during a brief phone call after the brutal and bloody shooting, meaning that once again she had eliminated those who stood in her way, those who were considered better, smarter, and worthier than her. The biology professors, the best daughter, mother, sister, Amy Bishop. Yes, she had done this before, but many years ago the death of a person who was close to Amy went unpunished. Moreover, the woman managed to build her life and maintain her reputation despite the fact that her guilt was obvious. Huntsville, in a state of Alabama, is called the Rocket City because of its active participation in space exploration. It was here that rockets were produced for the US Moon program. After World War II, German aerospace engineer Werner von Braun was secretly transported from Germany to America, and it was in Huntsville that he developed the rockets that launched the country's first satellite into space. This little town can still safely be called a city of rocket builders, as the George C. Marshall Space Flight Center is still operating here. However, the presence of at least 3 higher education institutions makes it very youthful. Lots of students, cultural youth, motivated teachers. A person unfamiliar with Huntsville's history could initially have had a somewhat false impression that this was just a typical college town. At least, that's how it used to be. Until February 12, 2010, when Huntsville became the name of the scene of a horrific crime. Every American knows what happened here, and none of them will forget the name Amy Bishop, no matter how hard she tried to keep it untarnished, even taking her husband's last name after many years of marriage specifically for the trial. But more on that in order. Amy Bishop, a neuroscientist from the University of Alabama in Huntsville, arrived at one of the campuses on Friday, February 12th, for a faculty meeting from the biology department. She was calm and quite atypical for her, silent. A few minutes before the meeting started, Mrs. Bishop took her seat, exchanged a few words with her friend and colleague Deborah Moriarty. At 3 p.m., 13 professors and staff members from the biology department began discussing the agenda in a windowless conference room on the third floor of the Shelby Center for Science and Technology. The department chair, Gopi Padilla, handed out copies of the meeting program. Everyone was fussing over the list of topics they were going to discuss that day, and only Bishop radiated cold indifference, some kind of tragic serenity. In fact, inside she was like a taut string, in such a strong nervous tension that it seemed sparks could start flying off her at any moment. But Amy was able to control her emotions, not a single muscle twitched in her face for most of the meeting, while her slightly damp warm fingers, imperceptibly to those around her, gripped the cold barrel of the pistol in her purse. But the time had not yet come. A year earlier, the department had rejected Bishop's application to renew her contract for the position she held, and her lengthy attempts to appeal this decision were fruitless. She knew that when the semester ended, her job would end too. Much of the agenda for that meeting directly concerned plans for the next semester, in which Amy was no longer supposed to be there. Accordingly, her presence at this meeting was somewhat absurd. Like, while you're in the team, please show up. Probably a normal person without any extra complexes would not have been bothered by this, but not Bishop, whose self-esteem was extremely hurt in her own opinion. Biochemist Deborah Moriarty watched Amy across the table. Deborah knew all about Bishop's problems during her tenure. They had formed a friendship since Amy arrived on campus as an assistant professor in 2003. The women discussed work, their families, children. Bishop, for example, had 4 of them, and her eldest daughter was even studying here in Huntsville. Moriarty had recently become a grandmother. Despite her close relationship with Amy, Deborah vowed against her reappointment, and her friend knew about it. They discussed the situation and decided that it should not affect their close and cordial friendship. Nevertheless, Amy Bishop openly admitted to Moriarty the despair she was experiencing as a specialist, and that she considered her life over. For 45 minutes from the start of the meeting, Bishop simply remained silent, gripping the pistol in her purse. At 4:15, when everyone started getting up from their chairs and preparing to leave, she stood up and pulled out a 9mm Ruger sport pistol, immediately pointing it at Gopi Padilla. The blast was deafening, and the shot was accurate to the head. Bishop immediately fired again, hitting assistant Stephanie Monticello. Then she turned and fired at a biologist, Adriel Johnson. Everyone else was screaming in horror and fear, trying to hide under the table and behind chairs, realizing that Amy Bishop had blocked the only door, standing right in front of it with a gun in her hand. Deborah Moriarty, clearly not fully realizing what was happening at that moment, seeing Bishop calmly point the gun at her 4th colleague, Maria Raglan Davis, and fire at her. Moriarty dove under the table and crawled towards Amy. Wrapping her arms around Bishop's legs, Deborah raised her head and shouted, "Amy, don't do this. Think about my daughter. Think about my grandson." Alas, looking down at Deborah was a completely different woman. Bishop's face was focused and calm. Her gaze was empty. Not a single emotion after so many shots at people she knew well. Without even changing her expression, Amy simply pointed the gun at Moriarty. Click. It jammed. Another click. The hitch with the gun saved Deborah's life. Only hers. Moriarty crawled past Bishop into the hallway. The friend followed her, nervously pulling the trigger over and over. When Amy finally stopped to try to fix her gun, Moriarty sneaked back into the conference room, and another colleague barricaded the door from the inside so the villainess could not back in. This maneuver by Deborah saved many lives because at that very moment 6 people were already injured, 3 of whom would die on the spot. Realizing that she could not continue what she had started, Bishop simply went downstairs to the ladies' room where she rinsed the gun and shouted, along with her bloody plaid jacket, into the trash can. Then she entered the lab and asked the student if she could borrow his cell phone. Amy called her husband Jim, who often picked her up after classes, and said, "I'm done." The poor man had no idea how ambiguous that phrase was that day. When Jimmy, or James Anderson, as his wife called him, would arrive at the university, he would find many ambulances and police cars. In one of them, Amy would be put in right before his eyes. We'll never know what Bishop planned to do next, but she left the building so calmly, simply not expecting that the surviving colleagues would quickly pull themselves together, call the cops, and the police would react so promptly. She was met by the deputy sheriff at the exit. In addition to ambulances and police patrols, crowds of journalists instantly arrived at the university. By 2010, mass shootings in America had almost lost that shock effect. Not because people were indifferent, no, but it was only February, the second month of the year, and since January 1st, there had already been 15 other incidents, each of which had injured at least 3 people. However, Amy Bishop's case was notable because she did not fit the profile of a mass shooter. Women very rarely commit such crimes, especially having a higher education, some degrees, a large family, 4 children. No one would be surprised if something like that was committed by a teenager from a troubled family, but not a 45-year-old biology professor with no criminal history, confirmed mental health issues, and so on. Such women don't shoot people. Families, children, grandchildren, and maybe even some funny fat dog await them at home. Dissatisfaction with the situation with the contract that they refused to extend, of course, could have added fuel to the fire, but it didn't seem like a weighty enough reason for such an atrocity. The next morning after Bishop was taken into custody, a man named Paul Fraser called the sheriff's office in Huntsville and said he was the police chief in Braintree, Massachusetts, a suburb of Boston where Amy Bishop grew up. Fraser said, "I think you might be interested to learn something about the woman you'll have in custody. In 1986, he shot her own brother." At that very moment, the detectives realized they should study Amy Bishop's past in more detail. On December 6, 1986, Amy Bishop, who was only 21 years old at the time, was at her family's home in Braintree, Massachusetts. Just a year earlier, their home had been robbed, and the experience instilled deep fear in the girl. Amy had mentioned this to her parents many times, and eventually her father, Sam Bishop, bought a shotgun and taught his daughter how to load and use it to give her confidence. The man simply wanted to protect his daughter from fear and a sense of insecurity, but he also made sure that she could handle loading the gun herself, because for safety reasons, the barrel was kept unloaded in the house. On that day, December 6th, something alarmed Amy. According to her own statements to the police, she was scared, so she took the shotgun out of the father's closet and took ammunition from his dresser. Then, Amy loaded the weapon herself. Sometime later, when the girl realized that there were actually no objective reasons for concern, she decided that the gun needed to be unloaded. However, her dad had not taught her that, and Bishop had difficulties. Hearing that her 18-year-old brother Seth Bishop had returned home, Amy went downstairs to ask him for help, but at the moment when she turned to hand the shotgun to Seth, it fired, and the bullet hit the young man in the chest. The police arrived at the scene, and Amy's mother, Judy Bishop, told the officers that she was present during the fatal shot and that it was an accident. Seth was rushed to the hospital. The doctors made every effort to save him, but the wound was too dangerous. A few hours later, the young man died. After a brief investigation, the death was ruled an accident, and no charges were brought against Amy Bishop. Residents of the area expressed their condolences to the family over this tragic incident and simply went on with their lives. Because what do you do in such cases? They mourn the absurdity and tragedy of the death of such a young man, even sympathize with the one who unintentionally inflicted a fatal injury on a loved one. Then they lock up their gun cabinets more securely, those that almost every American home has, hide the ammunition, conduct preventive talks with the children. Yes, that's about it. But Amy and Seth's mother was not at home at that moment, and Amy didn't fire accidentally. Amy Bishop was born on April 24, 1965, to Sam and Judy Bishop. They lived in Iowa City while Sam earned his degree in art. When he finished his studies, they returned to Massachusetts, where Sam became an art teacher at Northeastern University. The young family settled in Braintree, where in 1968 Sam and Judy had another child, a son named Seth. Amy grew up quiet and reserved, and although she excelled at most things she did, she never felt that her parents noticed or appreciated it. From childhood, she mentally competed with any children who could outdo her in any way. Some victories came easily to Amy. As soon as she put in effort and did something better than others, her restless inner self would calm down for a while. The only person who surpassed Amy Bishop in everything was her own younger brother, Seth. If Amy excelled in her studies, Seth did even better. He was a master of mathematics and natural sciences. Amy was praised for her perfect pitch when she took up the violin, but soon Seth also became interested in music. In a short time, it turned out that with a violin in his hands, he was a virtuoso. On top of that, he could do everything she couldn't. He had friends, teachers loved him. Seth was a member of the Boston Youth Symphony Orchestra, was named concertmaster of their high school, received a National High School Award in mathematics, and first place in the Science Award in both chemistry and biology categories. Their school's literary journal even published several of his stories. Amy had to meet too many requirements to surpass him, and at some point it became too obvious that it was simply impossible. The young man was more gifted, very hardworking and diligent. Amy's resentment only intensified when they both went to high school, where she earned a reputation as a strange girl, while Seth got along and made friends with everyone. When her brother graduated from high school and enrolled at Northeastern University, where their father worked, and Amy was already a student there, everything only got worse. There Seth blossomed and showed his full colors. No matter what success Amy achieved in science, Seth always overshadowed and surpassed her. But perhaps the main trigger in the relationship between brother and sister was their parents themselves. Amy felt that they were too favorably disposed towards Seth. While at Northeastern University, Amy joined the Dungeons and Dragons Club. The girl's plan was for this to increase her popularity, which of course did not happen due to her introversion and isolation. However, it was there that Bishop met her future husband, her classmate, Jimmy Anderson. In most stories about Amy Bishop, he is mentioned as James, and this is not a mistake, but a petty whim of Amy herself. According to Mr. Anderson, Amy considered the name Jimmy rustic, and he loved her too much and gladly played along, realizing that his wife moved in intellectual circles and probably knew better. As a child, Amy suffered from asthma and severe allergies, which often required her to go to the hospital. It was during these trips that she actually became interested in science. She wanted to get cured and thought she could do it through genetics. Jimmy was also studying biology, and he and Amy had a lot in common, but his relationship with her brother didn't work out either. Seth was not interested in being friends with Jimmy, although there were no particular reasons for it. Seth and Jimmy were just too different. Of course, at a common family gathering, they had something to talk about, but no more than that. On top of everything, Seth tried to help his sister and gave Amy advice on how to make friends. The girl was exclusively irritated and outraged by this, although she didn't show it. In her own belief, everything came too easily to Seth. When he got a bright red Camaro, the guy's popularity only increased. His academic successes didn't stop. Seth received awards and enjoyed universal recognition. The young man didn't boast and sometimes even forgot to notify his relatives about his latest achievement. But Judy, the kid's mother, meticulously tracked all the news about her son in the morning newspaper and would show it to Amy every time, saying, "Look what your brother has accomplished again." Mom was just proud of her child, not realizing what kind of fire was burning in Amy's soul in each of those moments. In early December, Seth told his parents that he didn't want anything for Christmas. The reason was simple. The young man couldn't think of anything he really needed, something that he really wanted. And he considered spending money on formal gifts inappropriate and stupid. Amy had to listen for hours to her parents tell stories about how sensible, sweet, and reasonable her brother had grown up to be. In the run-up to the holidays, the girl spent much more time at home, and her hatred for her brother grew by the day. Seth this, Seth that, Seth good job, Seth got another word, Seth's teachers praise him. Just a few days later, on December 6th, 1986, Seth was gone. An accident, a tragic coincidence. Probably when Judy Bishop, Amy's mother, lied to the police that she was in the house at the moment and saw how it happened, she believed her daughter and wanted to protect her. Not to allow her life to break when the girl was struggling so hard because of Sam's death and suffering from guilt. Unwittingly, the woman protected the monster who took her other child. Two weeks after the shooting, Jimmy and Amy went to the Anderson house where Amy met her future husband's mother for the first time. None of them said anything to her about the death of Bishop's brother. Jim didn't even mention that they had been to the guy's funeral. On August 20, 1989, Jimmy and Amy got married. It seemed she was still competing with her brother even after his death, for the wedding was held in the same church where Seth's funeral had taken place. Finally, she had surpassed him in something. She had started a family, and he hadn't. This is a very important moment in Bishop's story. And usually killers who accidentally or intentionally took someone's life and got away with it avoid such places. Whether they feel pangs of conscience or not, the memory of the deed is often still traumatic, no matter what the criminal is going through, their own conscience, soul, or freedom. But Amy came here as if to tell Seth, "Look, I'm getting married, and you're dead. This is my day and all eyes are on me. You lie in the ground." After the wedding, the girl did not take her husband's last name because she wanted to become famous in the future precisely as Dr. Amy Bishop. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that women must take their husband's last name by default, but the fact that she didn't when she got married is important. Believe me, any girl would have happily wanted to become Mrs. Anderson in Amy's place. But for Amy, there was her own symbolism in this story, understandable only to her. Her brother was a good, talented guy, and people still remembered his despite the passing years. In the eyes of many people, the girl still encountered sympathy that kept overshadowing her own achievements time and again. To become the most famous bishop, that's what she wanted. To become so famous that everyone would only talk about her and not even remember her deceased brother. By that time, both Amy and Jimmy had graduated from Northeastern University. Bishop wrote an honors thesis titled The Effect of Temperature on the Recovery of the Sea Lamprey after Complete Spinal Cord Transaction. Her work was indeed good. Moreover, it attracted the attention of recruiters from Harvard University, and she enrolled there to earn her doctorate in genetics. Jimmy was ready for the move. He could work on his own biology projects without being tied to any particular city. But Amy suggested to become a house husband on the pretext that she was the one in their couple making career strides now. Jimmy James, who after his wife's admission to Harvard was not even allowed to mention how he was called on his birth certificate, agreed with his wife's arguments. He was proud of her and felt less talented than she was. Now Amy decided right away to nip in the bud any possibility that Jim might one day excel in science and surpass her like Seth had. Nevertheless, she kept her promise to have children. According to the woman's plan, Jimmy was supposed to get his and be so busy that the thought of returning to science would not even occur to him. Over the next 4 years, the couple's first 3 children and all daughters were born. While Amy was working on her doctoral dissertation, Mr. Anderson tended to the infants. Bishop eventually defended her doctoral dissertation at Harvard and received her PhD. Jimmy time and again surpassed himself in the speed of changing diapers, feeding 2 and then 3 children simultaneously. In Harvard's professional community, rumors circulated that Bishop's much-suffering dissertation was very poor. These people believed she should not have received her doctoral degree at all. Nevertheless, she repeatedly made corrections and eventually, with difficulty, got her way, after which she moved on to postdoctoral studies. By that time, the Bishop Anderson family had fallen in hard times. Jimmy had trouble finding steady work, Amy was not doing well enough with her internship at Harvard Medical Center, and bills just kept coming in the mail. Amy's supervisor, Dr. Paul Rosenberg, had formed an unequivocal and extremely negative opinion about his new subordinate's dissertation, which he did not hesitate to tell Bishop directly. The woman was unprepared for this. It seemed to her that this level had been passed, if you will, and no one would delve into how well or poorly she had written her work. A scandal ensued. Amy was very aggressive, allowing herself to argue with everyone and shout without restraint. This in turn surprised Rosenberg. Bishop was not the first to barely get a degree in his memory, but many later achieved success through hard work. Amy's reaction scared him. He knew how to deal with diligent hacks, but had no idea how to calm the zeal of such an inadequate person in his view. In the end, Dr. Rosenberg convinced Amy to resign on November 13, 1993, frankly admitting that her anger had frightened him. The man breathed a sigh of relief when the suddenly calm bishop simply signed the papers and left without further arguments or hearings. He thought the strange story was over for him. On December 19, 1993, Dr. Rosenberg and his wife Harriet left town, and the person they hired to look after their cats found a white cardboard package on the porch. The woman took it and simply put it on the kitchen table before taking care of the animals. Later, that same day, Dr. Rosenberg and his wife returned home and noticed the package waiting for them in the kitchen. Here, it's important to clarify something. At the time, in the United States, the FBI was looking for a person they called the Unabomber. This name is an abbreviation for University and Airline Bomber. Someone was sending bombs to people working at universities and airlines. News of this was everywhere, and since Dr. Rosenberg wasn't expecting any packages and worked in the relevant field, he became suspicious. The man didn't rush cutting an opening in the center of the box, not along the seams as we usually do. Peering inside, he saw wires and a piece of pipe. It took the police just a few minutes to arrive on the scene and start evacuating the entire block. An operational group with a bomb squad arrived and examined the package. Inside were 2 homemade bombs about 11 centimeters in diameter, connected to 2 9-volt batteries, which would have gone off if Dr. Rosenberg had simply lifted the box flaps. The man's caution saved his life. The culprit had placed enough explosives inside to take Rosenberg's life and possibly injure Harriet if she had been nearby at the time of the blast. However, when the bomb was examined, it turned out that it was nothing like those made by the Unabomber. Moreover, it didn't even have the FEC, marking the abbreviation the Unabomber had established as the main one for his Freedom Club. The only person, in Dr. Rosenberg's opinion, who was so angry at him that they could go to extremes was Amy Bishop. The detectives listened to the doctor's assumption and decided to dig into Amy's life, as well as the lives of her family members. Very soon, they learned that many people who had worked with Bishop at various times were afraid of her. She had serious arguments with other people in the lab, some of whom Amy accused of trying to take credit for her work. When the cops interviewed someone who had grown up with Jimmy Anderson, he told them that several years ago Jimmy had problems with a neighbor, in connection with which the man asked his childhood friend to help him get a gun, and he helped. Anderson now owned a 9mm semi-automatic Ruger P85 pistol. The friend also informed investigators that not long ago he had talked to Jimmy, and Jimmy had told him that he wanted to kill Dr. Rosenberg. Moreover, the man had allegedly listed specific methods by which he thought he could take Rosenberg's life. He wanted to shoot him, blow him up, strike him, or strangle him. Of course, he said all this in his ironic manner in such a way that no one would take his words seriously. An explosives expert determined that Jimmy's chemical and engineering experience made him more than capable of creating a bomb in a box. Investigators obtained a search warrant for Amy's parents' home, the cottage, and the same property where the suspect lived with her husband and children, Jimmy's parents' home, and even Mr. Anderson's office. This, I should note, is that rare case when the police acted proactively, very quickly, and comprehensively. While they were searching Bishop's property, officers from the Braintree Police Department were on the scene for security purposes, and strangely enough, not a single one of them mentioned, or perhaps simply didn't remember, that once Amy had shot her brother in that house, and it had happened just 7 years ago. The investigators were able to partially trace the package of the box to the Avery Office Supply Company, which told them that according to the description of the contents in the shipment, it should have contained accounting spreadsheets with 5 columns. The FBI found similar spreadsheets in a desk drawer in Jimmy Anderson's office. They also found a check for an electric switch from Radio Shack and some parts from a hardware store that matched what the culprit had used to make the bomb. But that was it. And of course, the evidence was not enough to charge the couple with the crime, especially since Jimmy's friend, who had previously eloquently recounted dialogues with Anderson, suddenly stopped cooperating with the police. Amy and her husband remained the only suspects, but got off scot-free. Amy Bishop continued to conduct research at various hospitals, but regularly lost her job because it was impossible to work with her in the same team. She tried writing fiction, but people said her texts were horrible. Then Bishop tried to work with another writer, but burnt that bridge too, causing another scandal over a minor issue. In 2001, Amy gave birth to her fourth child, a boy whom the couple named Seth. Strangely enough, he was even born on his late uncle's birthday. It seemed that for a while Bishop calmed down. All her attempts to become famous in one way or another failed. During that period, the woman gave the impression of being resigned to the collapse of her plans. Moreover, she had a family, 4 children who adored their mother. So, she had something to fill this void and curb her dissatisfaction, or so it seemed. In 2002, Amy and her family went to have breakfast at IHOP, and when she asked for a high chair, the waitress told her that she had just given the last one to other customers. Instead of waiting, Bishop approached the person who had received that last chair and demanded that she give it to her. She told the woman, "I'm Dr. Amy Bishop. Do you even know who I am?" Her speech did not make the proper impression and the visitor refused to give Amy the chair. The manager immediately came out and politely asked Mrs. Bishop to leave. But before complying with his request, she punched her opponent in the face. Amy was arrested, but the charges were eventually dropped. Paradoxically, her 4 children and the stresses she had previously experienced, such as her brother's death and suspicious of sending a bomb, allowed her to avoid responsibility, even when she behaved inappropriately. In people's eyes, she appeared to be an unhappy woman who had gone through too much trauma and, moreover, had not yet recovered from her recent childbirth. In 2003, Amy was offered a position as an assistant professor in the biology department at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. This was a temporary position, but for talented scientists, it usually served as a stepping stone to a permanent contract. After moving to Huntsville, Amy and Jimmy began working on developing an automated cell incubator, essentially an electric petri dish. Here, Bishop also involved her husband, fully realizing that even if he proposed some key solutions in their development, she would be able to either turn the situation around attributing the invention to herself or convince her husband to give her all the laurels. The work on the petri dish was initially successful. The university president stated in a television interview that, in his opinion, Bishop's invention would change the ways of conducting biological and medical research. This brought the university more than $1 million in research grants, and Amy enjoyed the universal attention and recognition. But due to her immersion in her research activity, in 5 years of working on a temporary contract, she published only 3 articles, and not a single one appeared in major publications, although one of them published virtually everything without a second thought. The thing is, in order to transition to a permanent contract, it is required to publish many scientific materials, and it would be good if most of them end up in a number of specialized resources and publications. Amy did not take care of this. Meanwhile, the initial hype about the electric petri dish died down, and the scientific community gradually came to the conclusion that this development was too expensive and unnecessary. Well, sometimes research does not justify itself, but Bishop did not even bother to write useful articles for colleagues over so many years and did not conduct any other experiments at all. This was followed by reviews from her students. It turned out that Bishop's teaching style, to put it mildly, was not popular, and students went to the ratemyprofessor.com website to express their opinion. The students called the teacher detached and arrogant. The students personally delivered the petition to Dr. Gopi Padilla, the head of the Biological Sciences program, but he brushed it off. To a large extent, his practice of ignoring student complaints was based on the fact that the man believed that a neuroscientist educated at Harvard could attract a lot of grant money through his research, which is what all the university professors in the natural sciences did without exception. After 3 years of not having published scientific articles, Amy published her new material in the Journal of Neurochemistry in 2009. Later, but in the same year, this publication published another article by Bishop. Since this time it was a respected, peer-reviewed publication, Amy had a chance to return to her struggle for a permanent position. She then published her third article of the year, which appeared in the International Journal of General Medicine. This publication is not highly respected in the scientific community. Everyone knows that there the author can simply pay for publication. Moreover, in their article, Jimmy Anderson and their daughters with Amy were listed as co-authors and employees of the company founded by Jim specifically to use her work for collecting topics and publications under the name of Amy Bishop. Despite all the family's efforts, after lengthy consideration, Amy was denied the right to a permanent position. Amy was outraged and filed an appeal along with a claim of gender discrimination because one of the reviewers said that this woman is crazy. The professor was later given the opportunity to retract his comment, but he did not want to, remaining true to his point of view. Bishop's appeal was rejected. Then Amy hired a lawyer and continued to fight for what she believed she deserved. The loss of the opportunity to get a permanent contract hit both Amy's self-esteem and her wallet. In early February, Bishop received an email from the university stating that she had exhausted all her appeals. The decision would not be reviewed, and her work would end immediately after the end of the semester. On February 12, 2010, Amy conducted her daytime classes. After the lectures, she went home and had lunch with Jimmy, who later said he did not notice anything strange in his wife's behavior that day. She asked her husband to drive her back to work so she could attend a faculty meeting. It was Friday, and Jim asked his wife to call him after the meeting. Realizing how difficult it was for his wife, the man wanted to take her on a date and distract her a little from her worries. But at the end of the meeting, Amy Bishop, as you already know, opened fire on her almost former colleagues. 6 out of the 12 people present besides Amy herself were injured. 3 of them died. The others were only saved because the gun jammed, and Deborah Moriarty actually led her ill-fated friend out of the conference room and then returned there and barricaded herself along with the others. Dr. Cruz Vera called 911 from his mobile phone while Moriarty was carrying out her improvised maneuver. The dispatchers sent patrol officers to the university, and when Deborah returned, Cruz Vera handed her the phone. The man was bleeding, and the paramedic instructed Moriarty until the ambulance arrived, telling the woman exactly how to apply pressure to the wound to help Cruz hold on and survive. While this was happening, Amy fled down to the stairs to the bathroom on the 2nd floor. There, she rinsed the gun wrapped in her jacket and then threw it in the trash can right next to the bathroom. She borrowed the phone from a student and called Jimmy, telling him that the meeting was over and he could pick her up, as if it were just an ordinary day. A SWAT team arrived on the scene within minutes and was informed that the shooter was Professor Amy Bishop. Students were evacuated from the building, and paramedics rushed into the conference room to try to save the lives of the shooting victims. And while the police were combing the building, checking every classroom and office, a deputy sheriff noticed a woman who came out of a side exit. He ordered to stop. Bishop obeyed and did not resist. The officer simply handcuffed her and led her to one of the police cars. Jimmy Anderson arrived at the university just in time and saw his wife being put in the back of a police car. When the officer identified him as Amy's husband, he was also taken to the Huntsville Police Department. Dr. Gopi Padilla, Dr. Maria Regland Davis, and Dr. Adriel Johnson died at the scene. The other victims, fortunately, were able to recover from their injuries. During the initial investigation, detectives questioned Jimmy, who said he had no idea Amy was going to shoot anyone. At that point, Bishop's track record and biography were spotlessly clean on paper, and investigators were baffled by the simple lack of understanding. Why did she do it? Why? Mr. Anderson did not provide any details when investigators asked if he had a gun. He said yes, but did not specify which one, and that he and Amy had recently been shooting targets with that same Ruger. Amy Bishop flatly refused to admit that she was even in the conference room that day, despite the presence of 10 surviving eyewitnesses to the incident. On February 14, 2010, authorities formally charged Bishop with triple murder. When police searched the Bishop Anderson home, they seized computers, a video camera, and a folder Amy used to store old documents about her litigation for her tenure. They then found a piece of pipe that matched the type of pipe used in the bomb package mailed to Dr. Paul Rosenberg in 1993. A minor detail like the previously found evidence, but it led to an increase in the number of coincidences that led authorities to believe that it was indeed Amy and Jimmy who were the people who sent the bomb package intended for the crime to be pinned on the Unabomber, who was eventually caught in 1996. At this point, everyone already knew that the strange nickname concealed one Theodore Kaczynski, whose rich criminal history did not include an attempt on Rosenberg. When Braintree Police Chief Paul Frazier saw the news about the shooting at the University of Alabama in Huntsville, he read the article and learned that the shooter was Amy Bishop. It turned out that most of the police in Braintree knew that Amy did not accidentally shoot her brother, but the police chief at the time shielded her from responsibility because he was friends with Judy Bishop, Amy's mother, due to the fact that the woman at the time worked on the city council. As a result, all documents mentioning Amy's name or information about her arrest on the day of the incident were even expunged from the case of Seth Bishop's death. Chief Frazier will eventually find the missing files from the 1986 case. Among the many papers will be photographs of the Bishop home on the day of the crime. In one of them, investigators will notice the issue number of the National Enquirer magazine on the floor of Amy's bedroom. In this particular issue, a story was published about how the parents of actor Patrick Duffy were shot with a shotgun, and then the attackers used the weapon to hijack a car to escape. This would not seem so important if not for the true story of Seth Bishop's death, which finally became known to everyone. After Amy shot her brother, she ran out of the house, through the back door, crossed the street, and entered an alley that ended in a dead end at a Ford dealership. The dealership was closed, but there were some mechanics in the store. Amy approached them and pointed a shotgun at them, demanding they give her a car. She told them, "I am Dr. Amy Bishop, trying to escape from my husband." Two of the mechanics just ran away, and the third froze in fear. He didn't have time to get his bearings, but this man had no way to help the girl by fulfilling her demands. He did not have access to any of the vehicles. Soon the police officer arrived and ordered Amy to drop her weapon. She not only refused to do so, but pointed the barrel at the officer. Another officer snuck up behind Amy and ordered Bishop to drop the rifle when he got close enough to put his service pistol to her back. That's why the arrest took place despite the public being assured the kid's mother was there and knows it was an accident. Huntsville residents were outraged by the details of the failed investigations into Sarah's death. If they had held Amy responsible back then, she probably would not have taken up arms again in 2010. On June 16, 2010, a Massachusetts grand jury indicted Amy Bishop for first-degree murder of Seth Bishop. 2 days later, Amy cut her wrists with a razor blade in her cell, attempting to escape disgrace in her own coffin. She was found by a guard who was able to stop the bleeding and treat the wounds until the ambulance arrived at the jail. At trial, Amy pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. However, neither an analysis of her actions before, during, or after the university shooting, nor a psychiatric evaluation indicated that this person didn't know what she was doing. Of course, there are many disorders and illnesses that can lead a person to commit a crime. However, in judicial practice, a person is considered insane if, due to the peculiarities of their mental disorder, they truly do not realize that they are acting badly or even have a distorted perception of the world. That is, it is quite possible that they do something terrible while being firmly convinced that they are doing the right thing. But this is not about Amy Bishop. When Amy was offered a plea deal, she initially refused, continuing to insist on her insanity, but she eventually realized that she could not avoid the death penalty in that case. The prosecutor simply wanted to protect the victims and their families from having to go through the trial process over and over again, which is why he made Bishop such an offer again. On September 24, 2012, Amy Bishop pleaded guilty to 1 count of capital murder and 3 counts of attempted murder, after which she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The state of Massachusetts refused to seek extradition of the arrested Bishop to prosecute Amy for Seth's death, as they knew she would never leave prison in Alabama. Bishop, on the other hand, said she wanted this trial and that she had been slandered. Despite the fact that Amy waived her right to appeal, she appealed her sentence in 2013, citing that she did not understand her rights when she signed the waiver. However, her claim was simply dismissed. By some cruel irony, Amy's son, Seth Bishop, was killed on April 18, 2021, from an accidental shooting by one of his friends at the age of 20. Involuntary manslaughter usually carries a life sentence, but Vincent Harmon had just turned 18 at the time of the crime, so he had the opportunity, like any offender under 21 in the United States, to request being designated as a juvenile offender. In this case, the maximum prison sentence is reduced to 20 years.